The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the quiet suburban street. Birds chirped in the distance, and the occasional car passed by, its tires humming against the smooth pavement. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved as they walked past, where lawns were neatly trimmed, and kids played on bicycles under the watchful eyes of their parents. The world seemed calm, almost too calm, as if nothing could go wrong in this peaceful corner of the city. A young black man in his 20s strolled down the sidewalk, his hands tucked into the pockets of his hoodie. He looked like any other guy coming home from a long day at work. Tired, maybe a little distracted, but generally at ease. His sneakers scuffed the pavement as he walked, the sound soft and rhythmic. There was a quiet confidence about him, but if one looked closely, they'd notice the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked from side to side, as though he were always aware of his surroundings. Though the day was bright and the street appeared serene, there was a palpable sense of unease in the air, like a storm cloud waiting to form on the horizon. It was the kind of feeling that only someone who'd been on edge his whole life could recognize. As the man continued down the sidewalk, he heard the faint hum of a car engine slowing down beside him. He glanced to his right, his instincts immediately alert. A police car had pulled up next to him, the officer inside watching him closely. The man kept his gaze ahead, his steps steady but his mind racing. He didn't want to make eye contact, didn't want to draw attention. He had learned long ago to keep his head down in situations like this. The officer rolled down the window, the sound of the glass cutting through the stillness of the street. "Hey, you! Stop for a second." The officer's voice was sharp, without explanation. The man froze for a moment, confusion creeping over him. He hadn't done anything wrong, he was just walking home like anyone else. But he obeyed. He had no choice. He stopped, his heart beginning to beat faster, unsure of what was about to happen. The officer leaned out the window, eyeing him with suspicion. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, his tone cold and demanding. The man swallowed, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just coming from work," he replied, still standing in place, his hands tucked into his pockets, trying not to make any sudden moves. "And where exactly are you going?" The officer's voice was sharper now, his eyes scanning the man's face, as if searching for something. "I'm heading home," the man answered, trying to remain calm, but the officer's relentless questioning was starting to feel invasive. The officer squinted at him. "You look suspicious. Just walking around here with no reason? You sure you're not up to something?" The tension in the air thickened, and the man's stomach tightened. He hadn't done anything, but the officer wasn't backing off, and that sense of unease from earlier was now a sharp knot in his chest. The officer's eyes narrowed as he leaned further out of the window. "Show me your ID," he demanded, his voice sharp and impatient. The man hesitated for a brief moment, his stomach churning. There was no reason to ask for it, no reason to even be stopped in the first place, but he knew better than to argue. With a deep breath, he pulled his wallet from his back pocket and handed it to the officer, trying to keep his hands steady. His fingers brushed against the cool leather as he slid it out, but the officer didn't even glance at it before shaking his head. "This isn't enough," the officer muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. He held the wallet in one hand and reached for his radio with the other. "I'm running your name through the system," he said, already tapping the keys. The man's heart skipped a beat. His palms felt clammy, and his mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. He'd never been in a situation like this before, not like this. The officer's gaze was locked on him, as if scrutinizing every inch of his face, his posture, even the way he stood. "You look like trouble," the officer added, the words cutting through the already heavy air. "What are you really up to, huh? You look like you've got something to hide." The man's throat tightened. His frustration was growing, but his fear kept him silent. He couldn't raise his voice, couldn't argue back, because he knew how quickly things could escalate. He tried to stand still, but the growing discomfort gnawed at him, the officer's gaze making him feel like he was guilty of something, even though he had done nothing wrong. The officer suddenly threw open the car door, slamming it against the sidewalk. "Stand still," he barked, taking a step toward the man. He didn't wait for a response before pushing him back slightly, his hand reaching for the man's chest, then his sides. The officer began patting him down, his hands rough, intrusive. The man's body stiffened, every touch feeling like an invasion. He hadn't done anything wrong. He just wanted to go home. But he couldn't protest. The power was all with the officer. He could feel his chest tightening, his breath shallow. Each moment dragged on, making him feel smaller, more powerless. The officer's hands roamed over his body unnecessarily, and the man felt humiliated. His skin burned with shame, but he was trapped, unable to do anything but stand there and let the search continue. And then, as if adding insult to injury, people began to pass by. A woman on her evening jog glanced over, her eyes flicking between the officer and the man, her pace quickening as she pretended not to notice. A couple walked by, holding hands, their faces filled with curiosity, but choosing to avoid the scene. The eyes were everywhere now, the silent judgment hanging in the air as the man stood there, a target for everyone to see. The feeling of being publicly humiliated, of being reduced to something less than human, was unbearable. The eyes on him felt like they were pressing down, and the sense of isolation was suffocating. He wanted to disappear, to escape, but the harshness of the moment, the weight of being profiled, kept him rooted to the spot. It was as if everyone around him was watching, and yet no one was willing to help. It was as if he didn't matter. As the officer continued his aggressive search, his hands still roaming over the man's body, the tension in the air seemed to grow heavier. But then, suddenly, the sound of another police car pulling up broke the charged silence. The man's heart skipped a beat as the new car came into view. A marked squad car, its sirens off, but its lights flashing slowly in the late afternoon sun. The officer who had been harassing him froze, his posture stiffening as he glanced quickly toward the new arrival. The sound of the second car's engine seemed to pierce the heavy atmosphere, and the officer visibly faltered, his hands pausing mid-motion as his eyes shifted nervously between the man and the new officer stepping out of the vehicle. The new officer was well-dressed, his uniform neat and crisp. There was something about the way he carried himself, confident yet calm, that instantly put the man at ease, even if the situation was far from over. The second officer walked toward them slowly, his eyes scanning the scene, and then turned to the man. His voice was calm, respectful, as though he were speaking to someone he knew. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his tone soothing, like a breath of fresh air in the midst of the chaos. The first officer seemed visibly shaken now, his earlier aggression melting into a nervous energy. His posture hunched, and for the first time, the man noticed the subtle shift in the first officer's demeanor. He seemed to be backing down, no longer the dominant figure he had been moments ago. The second officer glanced back at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice still controlled but carrying an edge of authority. The first officer stumbled over his words, fumbling for an explanation. "I was just checking his ID," he mumbled, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "Just making sure." The second officer didn't let him finish. His eyes shifted back to the young man, and suddenly, a look of recognition flickered across his face. He turned to the first officer with a stern expression. "This is the mayor's son," he said, his voice now laced with a hint of urgency. "You're harassing the mayor's son." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. The first officer's face drained of color, his eyes widening with horror as the realization sank in. The man could see the fear in the officer's eyes now. The bravado was gone, replaced with deep regret. I'm sorry," the first officer stammered, his hands now raised in a gesture of apology. "I didn't know, I didn't mean to." His voice trailed off and his face twisted with a mix of panic and shame. "Please, I'm sorry." But it was too late. The damage had already been done. The man's frustration simmered just beneath the surface, the humiliation still lingering like a bitter aftertaste. The second officer, now realizing the gravity of the mistake, quickly stepped in, his tone softer now as he turned back to the man. "I'm really sorry about this," he said. "This won't happen again. I'll make sure of it." The first officer continued to apologize profusely, but it was clear the moment had passed. The man stood there, his chest tight, the truth stinging like a slap to the face. The officer had no idea who he was, until it was too late. And now the air was thick with the bitter knowledge that the only reason this was stopping was because of who he was. The mayor's son stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing as he processed what had just happened. His body still buzzed with the lingering tension of the confrontation, his hands clenched tightly into fists as the officer continued to apologize. The weight of it all was crushing. Anger, disbelief, and exhaustion churned inside him, each emotion fighting for dominance. He had never experienced anything like this, not in such a personal way. He had always known, deep down, that there was inequality in the world. But to feel it, so raw, so immediate, was something he couldn't have prepared for. His chest tightened as the second officer, the one who had stepped in to defuse the situation, remained calm, his voice still respectful. "I'm really sorry this happened," the officer said again, his words sincere. "This shouldn't have gone down like this. It won't happen again." The mayor's son nodded stiffly, barely hearing the officer's words. What was an apology worth when the damage was already done? What was an apology worth when it was only because of his father's position that this situation was even stopping now? He could feel the sharp sting of humiliation in his chest, but it was something deeper, something that made his heart ache. He had been treated like a criminal, a threat, simply because of how he looked. That sense of vulnerability, of being judged before his humanity was even acknowledged, would stay with him for a long time. The first officer, who had been so aggressive just moments ago, now stood with his head down, avoiding the mayor's son's gaze. His eyes flicked nervously to the second officer, then to the ground. Without saying another word, he climbed back into his squad car, the door slamming shut with finality. The car backed away slowly, the officer's face still a mask of embarrassment and regret. The mayor's son exhaled slowly, trying to steady his breath. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, just taking in the scene. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but beneath it all, a deep ache settled in his chest. He couldn't help but wonder how many others had gone through this, had been treated this way, and hadn't had the luxury of a second officer showing up to make things right. How many other young black men, without a powerful name behind them, had faced this same humiliation, and worse? The realization hit him like a wave. This wasn't just a bad encounter, it was part of a much larger, more painful reality. The feeling of being unseen, of being treated as less than human, wasn't something he could ignore anymore. It wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a system, a pattern that ran deep, one that had been in place for years, for generations. But in that moment, as the last of his anger began to fade, something else stirred within him, determination. He had been shaken to her, but he wasn't going to let this experience define him. He wasn't going to let it silence him. It hurt, yes, but it also ignited something inside him. The knowledge that he could be a voice, a force for change, burned brighter than the sting of that moment. With a final glance toward the retreating officer, he straightened up and began walking again, this time with a sense of purpose. His footsteps were slower, more deliberate, but the weight he carried now was different. It was heavier, yes, but it also felt like a call to action, a responsibility he couldn't ignore. He wasn't just the mayor's son. He was someone who had a platform, someone who could make a difference. And in that moment, he knew that this painful experience, this injustice, would fuel his fight for justice, moving forward. It was time to use his position for more than just privilege. It was time to make real change. The police cars slowly drove off, their sirens fading into the distance as the street returned to its usual quiet rhythm. The sounds of birds chirping and cars passing by seemed to fill the air once more, as though nothing had happened. People continued on with their routines, oblivious to the tense moment that had just unfolded on their very doorstep. But for the young man, everything had shifted. The weight of the experience still pressed down on him, lingering in his chest like a dull ache. He had been shaken, rattled to his core. But as he continued to walk, something inside him had changed. The injustice he had faced wasn't just a moment, it was a painful reminder of the world's harsh reality, a reminder of the systems that kept people like him in their place. Yet, despite the weight of the past few minutes, there was a quiet resolve in his step. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined. He had a voice, a platform, and he would use it to challenge the status quo. His journey had just begun, and though the path was uncertain, one thing was clear: he wouldn't stay silent. Change was coming, and he was going to be a part of it. Thank you for watching this powerful story. If it resonated with you or made you think about the world in a different way, please take a moment to like, comment, and share. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring more meaningful content to you. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, so you can stay updated with all our latest stories. Your engagement helps us keep these conversations going, and together, we can make a real difference. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let us know what you think. Thank you for being part of this journey, and remember, your voice matters. Stay tuned for more.